Talk of the Trollway spotlights Mount Horeb, Wisconsin's unique artists, entertainers, hobbyists, and personalities. Funding for Talk of the Trollway is provided by Miller & Sons Supermarket.
Fisher King Winery may have just celebrated their 3-year anniversary, but head winemaker Alwyn Fitzgerald has been fermenting grapes for years leading up to the opening of the urban winery. Fitz, as he is known to his friends, now produces wine from grape to bottle entirely in-house under the Fisher King banner, including such favorites as Trolltown Red, White Whisper, and Blue Rapture. On this episode of Talk of the Trollway, we'll find out how Fitz got his start in the winemaking trade, why he prefers to use local ingredients, and what drew him to the village of Mount Horeb. I'm your host, Gary Schutz.
I've actually been making wine for many years, but exclusively as a home winemaker, as a non-commercial winemaker. And I think my interest in wine got started, both of my parents are European, my mom is German, and my dad is Irish. And I remember sipping wine at the dinner table at age 6, maybe even younger. And of course back then, not thinking very much of it, not liking it, but it was part of our family culture. And I think I just had this interest in it. And it was actually in high school I expressed a little more interest in it. I went to my mother and just said, well, what's this all about? How does this work? How do you make wine? What's going on here? And she, at her encouragement, she said, well, go out and buy a book or two and go find some equipment and learn. Go ahead, explore it. Her only bit of advice to me back then was just don't get carried away. After high school, I went out and I got a biology degree, which, by the way, has turned out to be very handy and helpful for being a commercial winemaker. And that is kind of critical because fundamentally, fermentation is a biochemical process.
Absolutely.
And the more that you understand the chemistry of winemaking, the better your wine has the potential of being. To make good wine, a very important piece of that is following that business adage, which holds true for business in general, but particularly in winemaking, and that is what gets measured gets managed. We're out there every single day measuring those tanks on various parameters. We're doing titrations all the time because we don't want to not know what's going on in the tanks. We want to know, and we want to make corrections as needed. Otherwise, you'll get a horrible surprise. I have a bias towards using Wisconsin-grown grapes. Not a mission, that sounds a little too strong, but
An interest
in promoting Wisconsin grape growers and what we can do here with our own grapes right here in Wisconsin. You have to try to pick wines that you're going to make out of grapes that make those wines that you think will sell. I mean, that's kind of important. And
Absolutely.
It's not all clear cut, but you do know what some of the popular varieties out there. You have to get some sense of what people's tastes in wine, even if it's not a specific variety, that they sort of seek this type of wine. And you just come up with wines that you produce each year that you hope are going to be the ones that sell the next year. It's not a cookbook thing. It's not a recipe. Basically, what you do is you learn the principles of winemaking.
Sure.
And it's not so much, okay, add this much sugar, do this until then take this out, do that. I mean, it's not so much a recipe-driven type business as it is if you know lab technique and sanitation practices, and you have an understanding of how the various phases of the winemaking process, how those things that you do influence what is happening with the wine and what the outcome is, then even if you're encountering a difficulty or some new thing that's happening, you have a basis for saying, well, we don't want it quite like this, we want it a different way, so we need to do this. We need to put in this additive. We need to make these changes to the wine. We need to lower the pH.
Sure.
Okay, so it's a dynamic process, and it's just kind of based on the basic principles of enology. There are times that you can find wines out there in the world that are named after the varietal, Pinot Noir, and then there's other times you'll find a wine that has either a fanciful name, like we have on some of ours, or it is more from a region or something like that. So it gets a little confusing sometimes to people.
Absolutely.
But when you start talking about making a wine from a specific varietal, then that varietal, while there's going to be variations on it, it's not just genetics, it is very much genetics, but it's also environmental conditions. Where it's grown, how it's grown, what were the metrics when it was harvested, how much sugar content, what's the acidity, was there disease in the vineyard at all that year, did it ripen fully? There's all these variables and then there's local terroir, the term for the local earth, the microclimate and the soils and the things that are on a very local level that can affect the flavor of the grapes that are coming off the field. But in general, because it is a specific varietal, it has a certain flavor profile or potential. And that's the nature of the grape.
If your interest is in using local materials,
right.
Why not go to California or wherever? Why Wisconsin? Why Mount Horeb?
First of all, I live in Wisconsin.
Excellent reason.
And I don't want to move to California. I raised a family here. But the second reason is, here there's an opportunity. It's almost like, it's interesting, it's like a two-edged sword. On the one hand, we haven't had the types of grapes here and the type of industry activity that would bring us to the same size as a California wine industry. But because of that, and now that things are changing in the landscape for wineries in the state, it creates more opportunity because we're starting out with fewer wineries and there's room for growth.
Can you describe that changing landscape? What's changing that's making Fisher King or any other winery more viable?
Wine consumption is totally on the rise. I mean, nationwide, internationally, and in Wisconsin, and it has been for some time. In 2005, for the very first time ever, wine supplanted beer as the alcohol beverage of choice in the country. And I don't know if it still is in that spot, but the point is, it shows the increasing popularity of wine. Secondly, we had a very limited number of grape varieties that could make wine that were able to grow in Wisconsin and handle our cold, harsh winters.
Okay.
And that is changing because now there are a number of different viticultural research schools that every few years they release another 1 or 2 or 3 new hybrid varieties. They go through trials to make sure A, they can survive our winters, B, they grow well, they're disease resistant, and probably most importantly, C, they can make decent wine. So we have more and more opportunities and options available, and it will continue to be so as we march forward. This will put things in perspective, I think. In the year 2000, in the entire state of Wisconsin, there were only 13 federal and state permitted wineries in the entire state. And in 2013, last year, there were over 80. When I was first exploring opening up a winery around here, I didn't really want it to be in Madison, at least not in the beginning or anything. I didn't want to start there for a number of reasons. It would just be one more business in the Madison cosmopolitan area. Property rental rates per square foot costs were high. I wanted it to be out a little bit from Madison. I wanted it to be fairly close to Madison because it's a great market. But I wanted it to be to evoke the countryside, to evoke being out in a little bit of a rural setting.
Sure.
Our business model was an urban winery to start, although we may at some point branch out again a little more into the countryside on the more conventional winery approach. But our model was an urban winery, which was started out on the coasts. I didn't want to move from Madison, and I was starting my own business, so I basically drew a radius around Madison. I must have hit every single town in a 40-mile radius around Madison. I mean, I felt like Johnny Cash. I mean, I was everywhere. Always at the top of the list was Mount Horeb. It always seemed to float up to the top of the possibilities. Look at the festivals we have throughout the year here, so it brings people in. It's very tourist and visitor oriented. We have the Trollway, which is another attraction. It's the demographics of the Mount Horeb area reflect the Madison demographics overall. We have people who appreciate wine, consume wine, can explore, are interested in exploring and trying new things. They're educated. It's just a very good fit that way on the demographic side. We're right off 151, which is a major arterial. It might as well be an interstate highway going from Madison down to Dubuque and parts further west.
Sure.
We're near other attractions like Cave of the Mounds and Tyrol Basin and state parks and just so many different things around. And it's within very close striking distance to Madison. It's very easy for people to take the 20-minute drive out here. So in the end, I settled on Mount Horeb. For a startup urban winery, this is perfect. This has just been absolutely perfect. Last year, right through our side door back there on Grove Street, we brought in just about 50,000 pounds of grapes. Almost, with the exception of a little bit of that, almost all of it was from Wisconsin vineyards. The grapes come in off the field. We get it set up with the grower that when all the metrics are hit, they harvest them and they bring them in. We want them in within a day, preferably right away. But the cleaner the better, the fresher the better.
Okay.
You bring it in, we put them in this large machine, a crusher, it crushes them up. It actually is a destemmer, crusher destemmer, because you don't want the green stems in there. That just will add green vegetative flavors, so you strip those out. What that creates, what crushing creates, it's called must, and it's a slurry of grapes, of skins and pulp, and juice and seeds, and that we pump. If it's a red wine, we'll pump that right into a tank with all the skins in there and everything. We'll stabilize it, and then we'll pitch the wine yeast that we want to put in there, and it'll start fermenting. And it's very, very vigorous, very vigorous. Roils and boils. The yeast is doing this. It turns the wine into what looks like a cup of soup or a pan of soup on your stove. On the reds, we typically want to ferment on the skins. Most of the flavors and colors and compounds that get into red wines come from the skins, not the pulp.
Okay.
And so there's more than 350 known compounds in the skins of grapes, and we want the yeast to get in there and start chewing that up and getting as much of that released as possible. On the white wines, however, because they're going to be much lighter in flavor and much more delicate, we don't want, even though the skin of a white grape might be lighter in color, there's still a lot of compounds in there. So we don't want those heavy compounds in the white wine, typically. So we will press the skins and seeds and everything and get that away and only start with clear juice. And so that's how we start a white wine. After primary fermentation, which lasts a few weeks, it settles down into it switches over to a different type of pathway, a different type of fermentation. And that goes on for a month or two, in some cases maybe 3. And during that time, it's continuing to ferment, but at a much slower rate. And over that time, and even maybe a little beyond, what we're constantly doing is we're checking the tanks, we're checking the balance of different compounds in the tanks, making adjustments as need be. In the end, when you're finally done, and you balance the wine, the sugar is where you want it, the acidity is where you want it, you run it through a series of filtrations, and then we do the bottling, and then there you go. I'm of the philosophy that as long as the wine is technically well made, as long as it's well crafted, and it's balanced, and nothing bad got into it, some organism that you were trying to not have take over, but something got in there and gave it an off flavor. As long as the wine, you've been attentive back there and you produced the wine you wanted to produce, then the only criteria is if it tastes good, it is good. Because it's very subjective. A person who loves a dry red wouldn't have anything to do necessarily with a sweet white or the flavors of a particular one. We have White Whisper here. That's made from local grapes. We get people who come in here and they try the White Whisper. They love it. They just love it. They think they'll walk out of here with bottles of it. Another person comes in and tries White Whisper. They don't really like it. They'll go to the Chardonnay.
It's not their cup of tea.
Yeah. So
glass of wine.
Or a glass of wine. That's right.
Sorry.
But I guess the main thing is, it's kind of like it's so subjective but the key is to make a quality wine. And then and then you find out how popular it is or how many people like it. And there's no right or wrong in that sense.
How do you come up with your names?
It's like contemplating your navel or something. I will taste the wine, and I will just see what it evokes, and what words and what images or colors or feelings or whatever. What does the wine remind me of? What could I say about this wine that isn't exactly about the wine itself?
Sort of pushing it through that marketing filter.
Yeah. And just saying, what does this evoke in me? What sort of an emotional or visceral response do I get to this, and what words come to mind? And I usually come up with a pretty good list, and most of them you can't use or it wouldn't work. And then the last thing you have to do when you name a wine is when you think you've got it down to like 1 or 2 or 3 finalists, in your mind anyway, you better go check to make sure nobody else is, because there's so few original ideas out there. Everyone else,
Check that trademark
That's
list.
right. Check the trademark. At least do a Google search to see if somebody else has a wine that's named like that.
Sure.
So you don't wind up stepping on toes by accident.
What's the origin of the name Fisher King for the winery?
All the years I was growing up, I was a big reader, and in some of the stories, the fictional stories I was reading, there would be this mythological character that would show up, the Fisher King. Yeah, he's a character of rebirth and rejuvenation, and in a way, my winery, leaving the corporate world and coming here and starting a new business in my 50s, is like a rebirth or a rejuvenation of something. I kind of like that. After 35 or more years, working for somebody else, keeping the boss happy, playing company politics, having to deal with egos and agendas, marketing products and services that were fine, but not, I had to build up my enthusiasm for it.
Sure.
I just kind of, it was like one of those moments, where I remember, it's like the country western song, "Is that all there is, my friends?" It wasn't feeding my soul. I mean, the biggest thing going was the paycheck. I do miss that. I absolutely miss the paycheck. You don't want to take that for granted. But I just finally said, well, I've been hobnobbing with winemakers. I've been taking winemaking courses in different places. I've been making wine. I've been dreaming about a winer. I've been thinking about it. I got to be in my 50s, and I said, if I don't do it now, well, it's going to be a lot harder in my 60s.
Sure.
And it ain't happening in my 70s. The sad part is, as we move along in life, you start to see your time frame shrink a little bit. And so I just said, if I'm going to do it, this is the time to do it. I don't want to be the 85-year-old guy who looks back and says, oh, I should have done that. Why didn't I do that? I should have. And, so I just decided, why not? Let's pursue a passion and let's see what happens.
Next time on Talk of the Trollway, we turn to music with a singer-songwriter who is a familiar face here at Fisher King Winery.
Give up, go, come back home.
Corey Hart took the top spot in the Midwest round of the 2014 New Song Contest, and we'll wrap up our first year with a special performance from the folk singer who was named the 2012 Best Male Vocalist by the Madison Area Music Association.
You gotta give up the ghost and come back home.
I'm your host, Gary Schutz.
Talk of the Trollway is a production of Mount Horeb, Wisconsin's village cable station, Trollway TV. Funding for Talk of the Trollway is provided by Miller & Sons Supermarket. Talk of the Trollway is on Facebook, where your comments and story ideas are welcome.
All the years I was making wine at home, 50 gallons at a time, I would jazz up my little fake labels and say at the bottom, Fisher King Winery. And I just said to myself, if I can ever actually get my act together and open up a real honest-to-goodness commercial winery, I'm going to try to name it Fisher King Winery.